A war thousands of miles away could make your life in Canada more expensive by next week. Not someday, not in theory, not in some vague, abstract economic sense. In real life. At the gas station. At the grocery store. In your monthly bills. And, if things get worse, even in your mortgage. That sounds dramatic, but it is already starting. Because when a war hits one of the most important oil regions in the world, Canada does not get to sit on the sidelines just because it is far away. And the part most people still do not understand is this. The first thing to move is not always the battlefield, it is the price of energy. And once energy moves, everything else starts moving with it. Gas, shipping, food, interest rate expectations, household pressure, consumer confidence. That is the chain reaction. And by the end of this video, you are going to see why a conflict in the Middle East could quietly hit ordinary Canadians harder than many people expect. But there is one detail that makes this even worse. Canada produces oil. So why would Canadians still get squeezed? That is where this story gets more frustrating, because this is not just about war. It is about how the global system works, who really controls the price you pay, and why countries can produce energy and still watch their own citizens struggle. And once you understand that, a lot of what is happening in Canada right now starts to make a lot more sense. Let's start with the obvious question. Why does a war involving Iran matter so much in the first place? Because oil is not just another commodity. Oil is the bloodstream of the modern economy. When oil becomes unstable, almost nothing stays untouched for long. Cars need fuel. Trucks need fuel. Ships need fuel. Planes need fuel. Farms depend on fuel. Factories depend on energy. Food distribution depends on transport. Entire supply chains depend on stable energy costs. So when traders, governments, and companies see war near critical oil routes, they do not wait around calmly. They react immediately. They start pricing in risk. And risk has a price. That means even before there is a true physical shortage, markets can begin pushing oil higher simply because the danger of disruption has increased. And when that happens, the impact does not stay in financial markets for long. It starts leaking into everyday life. First, gasoline becomes more expensive. Then transport becomes more expensive. Then businesses pass those costs forward. And then households start paying more for things they were already struggling to afford. That is the part people feel, not the headlines, not the speeches, the receipt, the refill, the rent pressure, the grocery bill that somehow keeps finding new ways to get worse. And here is where the story gets personal for Canada. A lot of Canadians were already under pressure before this. Food still felt expensive. Housing still felt broken. Many families were still trying to recover from years of rising costs. Even when inflation numbers looked better on paper, life never fully felt cheap again. So this is not a situation where Canadians are being hit from a position of strength. It is more like being pushed while already off balance. And that makes every new shock more dangerous. Now here is the argument some people will make. They will say, Canada produces oil. If global prices rise, shouldn't that help the country? Shouldn't that protect Canadians? And on the surface, that sounds reasonable. But here is the problem. Canada does produce a lot of oil. That does not mean Canadians are protected from global oil pricing, because gasoline prices are not set by some patriotic formula that says, this oil came from Canada, so Canadian families get a discount. That is not how the system works. Oil is part of a global market. Prices move based on international supply, demand, refining capacity, transport costs, market expectations, and geopolitical risk. So even if Canada increases production, that does not automatically mean the person filling up their car in Ontario, Alberta, or British Columbia suddenly gets relief. In fact, one of the most frustrating parts of this entire system is that a country can be energy rich and still have citizens paying painfully high energy prices. That is one of the hidden tensions in this story. And it leads to the next problem. Once gasoline rises, it does not stay isolated, it spreads. Think about how food gets to a supermarket. It does not appear there by magic. It is grown, packaged, moved, refrigerated, shipped, stored, and delivered. Every step costs money, and many of those steps depend on fuel. So if energy becomes more expensive, groceries can become more expensive too. Maybe not all at once. Maybe not in a single dramatic spike, but enough to keep pressure alive, enough to stop things from improving, enough to make Canadians feel like the economy never really gives them a break. And this is where many viewers might start asking the question that really matters. If gas gets more expensive and groceries get more expensive, what happens next? The answer is where things become even more serious. Because if energy starts pushing prices higher across the economy, that can affect inflation expectations. And once inflation expectations become unstable, central banks pay attention, markets pay attention, lenders pay attention, mortgage holders pay attention. Suddenly, this is not just about filling up your tank. It becomes a broader question about whether borrowing costs stay high for longer, whether rate cuts get delayed, whether housing affordability stays ugly, whether families renewing mortgages face even more pressure than they expected. And if that happens, then this war is no longer just an overseas story. It becomes part of the reason why life in Canada stays expensive. That is the trap. And this is why people who only look at one part of the economy usually miss the full picture. They see oil and think gas. But the real story is larger than gas. Oil can affect confidence. It can affect transport. It can affect food. It can affect inflation. And inflation can affect rates. And rates can affect housing. So when people ask whether a war abroad can affect mortgages in Canada, the answer is not only yes. It is yes in a way that most people do not fully realize until the pressure reaches their own monthly budget. Now, does that mean everything is doomed? Not necessarily. But it does mean Canada is far more exposed to global shocks than many people want to admit. And it also reveals something uncomfortable about modern life in Canada. A lot of what determines how affordable life feels is not fully controlled inside Canada. It can be influenced by events happening in shipping lanes, oil markets, foreign governments, military escalations, and investor psychology far beyond Canadian borders. That is a hard reality. And it helps explain why so many people feel like life keeps getting more expensive even when politicians, analysts, and official numbers try to tell them things are improving. Because sometimes things are improving in one part of the system while new pressure is building somewhere else. And that is exactly why this moment matters. Because this war is not just another headline, it is a stress test. A stress test for fuel prices. A stress test for inflation progress. A stress test for household resilience. And maybe most importantly, a stress test for how much pain the average Canadian family can still absorb. If the conflict stays contained, the damage may be limited. If markets calm down, some of this pressure could fade. But if the situation worsens, or if oil routes face deeper disruption, then the economic shock could spread much further than people expect. And by then, it will not matter whether someone thought this story was just geopolitics. It will already be in the cost of living. That is the real point of this video. A war far away does not need to touch Canadian soil to affect Canadian lives. It only needs to hit the right pressure point, and energy is one of the biggest pressure points in the entire system. So when oil moves, Canada feels it. At the pump, at the store, in the housing market, and in the growing sense that ordinary people are always one global crisis away from getting squeezed again. That is why this matters, and that is why Canadians should pay attention now, not later. Because once the price shock reaches your daily life, it is already too late to pretend it was someone else's problem. If you found this useful, subscribe to Boreal Briefing for more clear breakdowns of the global events and economic forces shaping life in Canada.